Welcome to Good Grief, the podcast where resilience meets reality. I'm your host, Dr. Christine Malone. In this podcast, we delve deep into the stories of individuals who've triumphed over tragedy, adversity, and trauma. In every episode, we bring you raw and honest narratives from guests who faced life's most challenging moments head on. Through candid conversations, they share their journeys of resilience, shedding light on the strategies, mindset shifts, and support systems that empowered them to rise above their darkest hours. Join us as we explore the profound depths of human resilience and discover how, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and yes, good grief. Okay, listeners, thank you so much for joining me for this episode. My guest today is Jessica Fein, and we're going to talk about her experience with her daughter. She has a book called Breathtaking, a Memoir of Family, Dreams, and Broken Genes. So, Jessica, if you would, go ahead and just tell us a bit about yourself, and then we can talk about your story with your daughter.
Excellent. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me today. It is a real pleasure to be joining you. And I'm thrilled to share the story of how I became a reluctant expert in grief. And actually, it goes way back and starts before my daughter was even in existence, and back to my late 20s when I lost my first of two sisters. Mm. And when I was 27, my sister died suddenly, which is really pretty much the outset of my book, because that first experience with loss of that magnitude and of something so unexpected really did shape who I became and set the tone, if you will, for all the losses that came after. And so just to kind of lay the groundwork here, I have lost three parents, two sisters, and then, of course, most recently, my teenage daughter. So I am no stranger to grief and loss of every variety. The expected, the unexpected, the, parental, the, feeling like you've been orphaned. I am both a motherless daughter and a daughterless mother, if you will.
Yep.
And my book is the story really of how I built my family and how we raised my daughter. It is not in any way a story of my daughter's death. In fact, my book was written while she was still alive, and agented and sold and really was the story of her life. And in the editing process, that was when 1 week after her 17th birthday, she died. So, of course, yes, I did have to write an epilogue, but this is a book about the long and twisty road that my husband and I took to becoming parents, which was 5 years of very creative fertility treatments, followed by several trips to Guatemala where we adopted 3 babies. And we thought the hard part was over. When our daughter was 5, our middle child, Dahlia, she was diagnosed with an ultra-rare mitochondrial disease called Murph syndrome. And I'm sure we can get into that. But this really is a story about how we learn that we're capable of so much more than we think we are, how we learn that we can't control what's going to happen, and we have to figure out what we can control. And there are things we can control, but they're not the big things that we think, that no matter how hard we try, we can't fix things, that there are things we can't fix, I should say. And how I really learned that a multitude of things can coexist at the same time, that we could be dealing with the most insidious, degenerative, horrific disease imaginable, and we could create a life of joy and meaning and beauty for our children, for ourselves. And so there's, I think whether or not you have an ultra-rare disease, and I promise you that the people reading this book do not have the same disease my daughter had, but all of us think we have control. All of us have to learn how to navigate in a world where things happen and our reality has little in common often with the dreams and visions we had. So that's a very lot about what this book is actually about.
I love it. Thank you. Tell me, so Murph, and you said it's MERRF syndrome?
Yeah, Murph syndrome stands for myoclonic epilepsy ragged red fibers. It's a rare form of mitochondrial disease. So mitochondrial, but I didn't, and maybe some of the listeners don't, that mitochondria are the powerhouse of the cells, right? So converting protein into energy, you need mitochondria in every organ you have, right? And so if your mitochondria aren't working properly, your organs don't work properly.
Yeah.
Now, you can have bad mitochondria, some parts of your body, and other parts of your body aren't impacted. So, in fact, even if you take two people who have Murph syndrome, which again is one expression of mitochondrial disease, it may look very different between the two of them. Murph is rare, it's 2 in a million. And when our daughter became a little bit older, again, she was diagnosed at 5 and she lived to 17, she developed a secondary disease, Lee syndrome, which is a little bit more common. But what's not common is to have Murph that evolves into Lee. And in fact, there's only 6 in the world
Wow.
who are known to have had that dual diagnosis.
Wow. Oh, that is extremely rare. And
Yeah.
treatments for the disease, any?
Treatments really are about managing the symptoms. Now, the thing with any kind of disease is that you try to hold on and beat, science, right? In terms of science is constantly changing. If she was diagnosed today, would that look different than being diagnosed, 20
Right.
years ago? And there are different treatments being developed, and there's a lot of research, but not a ton, and certainly not a ton into the very specific kind of disease she had. And I'll tell you, I mean, one of the most powerful illustrations to me of the difference between having a rare disease and a more conventional, if you will, disease is while I was caring for my daughter,
Mhm.
I also became primary caregiver for my elder sister who was diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer out of the blue. Now, with my daughter, most doctors had never heard of Murph syndrome.
Right.
I
Right.
mean, we were in a hospital in Florida when she got very sick at age 9, where there was no metabolic specialist in the hospital. I mean, I had to be the expert, and I didn't even know what mitochondria were when she was diagnosed, And that often happens with parents, right? We become expert in a disease we wish we'd never heard of.
Yep.
But the difference when my sister was diagnosed with lung cancer, there was a whole floor in the hospital dedicated to lung cancer. The problem there was deciding which doctor we were going to go with because there were so many, which treatment we were going to choose, not trying to find a doctor who had heard of the disease. And I was navigating both of these two things at the same time. And it was a real insight into our healthcare system and how wildly different it is when you're dealing with something that's rare. And of course, it makes sense. It's like, where are researchers and pharmaceutical companies going to invest their funds? The thing that 6 people have, or the thing that's killing, tens of thousands of people or more?
Yep. No, that's definitely. I'm having worked in healthcare a long time. I definitely can think of many times I've seen that happen where it's something that I don't know. No one's doing any research on it, and it can be frustrating. But it's like, again, like you said, if
Yeah.
there's 6 people, and we've only got so
Yeah.
much.
And what I have found, because I've been in the rare parent community for a long time now, and I also have a podcast of my own, I speak with a lot of families, is that often it's the parents who end up spearheading
Yes.
when you're talking about rare disease, spearheading the research, spearheading, the efforts, whether that's through their time, through their profession, through their finances, but it comes to the parents.
Yeah.
I mean, remember the movie Lorenzo's
I
Oil?
was
That
just
was
going
all
to say. I
about
was
the
just going to
parents.
say. Yeah.
Yeah, we had a
That was.
fantasy. We were going to have something that was going to be like Dahlia's tincture. We were going to
Oh yeah.
solve this incurable thing.
Yeah. No. I was going to bring up that movie too, but I thought I'm sure everybody's probably most people I've watched it. I actually assign it to my students in one of the classes that I teach. So it's
Yeah.
kind of one of those things. But so tell me, Dahlia was the middle of your 3, or
Yes.
okay. So at the age of 5, so you already had all 3 of them at that point in time.
Yes, exactly.
Kind of just talk us through a little bit, like what was the family dynamic like when you received this? I would
Yeah. Well,
devastated.
I mean, the hard thing about a degenerative disease, as you know, is and especially for a child, because with a child with a degenerative disease, what happens is you're learning and growing and progressing, and at the same time, you're losing.
Yeah.
Right. So certain things you're learning how to do, but other functionality is going away. And, with Dahlia's disease, it was like so slowly in terms of the degeneration, and also so quickly. Like it seemed like both, you're almost not aware of it when it's happening, but when you step back,
Yeah.
you see what's been lost. So like a practical example of that would be when Dahlia was diagnosed, she was walking and running and jumping, not elegantly. She had balance issues, but she was doing all those things. And over time, and not a lot of time, in a pretty compressed amount of time, she started to need to wear AFOs, leg braces, and then she needed a walker, and then she needed a stroller when we were going long distances, and ultimately a wheelchair, and lost the ability to walk altogether. So you see the degeneration happen over time. And that's, really, really, really hard for the person going through it, first, foremost, and second most, and third most, but also for the people closest to her. And because when Dahlia was 5, she had a sibling who was 8 and a sibling who was 3. That's pretty young. And, our messaging was one thing at that age. But when she was 9, she got very sick. That's when she had a cold that became pneumonia, that became intubated, that became 3 months in the hospital. And that's when our lives really changed. Because what happened is when you're in the hospital for so long, you lose a lot of functionality. And for Dahlia, she lost her ability to breathe independently.
Mm.
And so at age 9, she had a tracheotomy, which for people who might not know is when you have a little hole in your neck and a breathing tube, and that becomes your breathing mechanism. And Dahlia was attached to a ventilator, and she lost her ability then to talk, to eat, to walk, to breathe independently, all these things. And yet we were still trying to, for as much as possible, provide a life that was quote unquote normal.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that's ludicrous. Nothing about our life was normal. For one thing, once she got her trach, she became an eyes-on patient. So she couldn't be alone for a second. Myself or my husband or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. Our house had strangers in it all the time. We had nurses and personal care attendants and people delivering machines and checking on machines. And it was like a grand thoroughfare of strangers in and out of the house, And our whole world revolved around Dahlia's room, what was happening.
Mm-hmm.
And still she was going to school and we were doing the things that families do, So it was this kind of tug of war between wanting to keep things normal as much as and as long as we could, and also understanding that this was not normal in any way.
Right. No, I completely relate to a lot of things you just said there. So my son that was disabled needed 24/7 care as well. He didn't have a trach, but he did have a feeding tube, and his injuries were such that he could not suck or swallow or protect his own airway. So he needed suctioning quite frequently. And
Suctioning. Yep.
multiple medications. And I wrote about this in my book where I talk about the family dynamic of living with a strange person in our home all the time. I mean, my husband and I were never alone without other adults in the home, whatever was going on. And everything did completely revolve around Ian's care. I remember canceling family events because it would be a sudden hospitalization or whatever it may be. And yeah, and I look back on that and think about how my other children's lives were impacted by, this us trying to be normal, but there was no normal in there. Of course, normal is a subjective term, but
it's a subjective term. Typical. I mean, I don't like really any of them.
But
I'll tell you what happens is these kids, they grow up with such a different understanding of the world, with so much empathy, with just a different kind of resilience. And, you wonder, would they have been that way anyway? Maybe. But being, in our case, Dahlia's siblings really did shape in many ways who all of us, who they became, and as Dahlia's parents, who we are today.
Yep.
I mean, I know I am not the same person I was before, and I have to imagine neither are they.
Yeah, no, I hear you. And I know for in my case, for example, my oldest daughter, who's now 31, was 7 when her 6 when her brother was born. And throughout his life, he lived 4.5 years. She was, of course, lived at home the whole time. And we went on vacation one time. It was my 2 older kids and me. We went on a vacation just to do again, the word normal family thing without having to worry about medicines and treatments and so on. And we were down at Disneyland and we're at the pool, and there's this extremely disabled boy with his parents in the pool, and parked by the side of the pool was a wheelchair. So what was interesting about it was all the other kids and families were at the other end of the pool. They didn't want to be anywhere near where this disabled boy was. Not probably because the parents didn't really want to have to try to explain it. They didn't want their kids to say something that might be, whatever how kids will say. But my daughter swam right up to him and started talking to him, even though he was nonverbal. And the parents, you could just tell, were so like, oh my gosh, there's a child here who's wanting to talk to our son. And then I came over and I'm asking about the wheelchair because we were about to transition Ian into a larger size wheelchair. And I thought they probably think we are just the most bizarre people ever. But and then my daughter went on to get a degree in early childhood education, and she's a preschool teacher now. She loves working with kids and has just this dynamic of how to work with kids and talk about kids that have disabilities, which I don't. Again, I'm sure it's part of who she is, but I also think that her experiences growing up definitely got her to see that this is okay. This is actually normal. This is actually happening.
Yeah. And I spoke recently at the Kennedy Day School in Boston, which is a tremendous school, which I write about in my book, about how we ultimately had to move our daughter out of public education, which we fought and fought and fought, and put her in this school that turned out to be the right place for her. It's on the grounds of a hospital, and they deal with all kinds of complex medical situations. And I spoke to the entire faculty, and afterward, the number of people who came up, they each came up, I signed the book, whatever. The number of people who in that interchange told me they had grown up with a sibling with a severe disability, and then they went into this professionally. But I want to go back to one thing you just said, which is this interaction in the pool, because, I think we as parents often tell our kids when they see somebody who's disabled, don't stare.
Yep.
And the impact on that is that what happens is the kids then deliberately look away.
Yep.
Now imagine you're a 4, 6, 8-year-old kid in a wheelchair or whatever, and every time you see another kid, they deliberately look away.
Right.
The parents, of course, are just trying to be respectful, but it is so cruel, and we don't give our kids enough credit because kids can be so fine and like, hey, why don't your legs? Oh, my leg. Why do you have that chair? My legs don't work as well. Oh, cool. Let's play catch or whatever it is, right? But when we tell the kids don't stare, we are doing a disservice. It is better to teach them to smile and say hi.
Yep.
Right? You don't stare if a kid has glasses. And so, maybe you need to say some kids need glasses, some kids need a wheelchair, whatever it is. But don't stare really puts such an isolation, which is already there, on the child and on the family.
Yep. No, great point. Great point. I completely agree with you. I know with my kids, with my youngest child, as a matter of fact, who was born after my son passed away, so he didn't experience that, but he was certainly raised in a way to understand that people with disabilities are part of our lives and so on. And he would ask me, I remember in the grocery store, there was a lady who had a malformed hand, and he said, "What's wrong? What happened to your hand?" or whatever. And other people in line were like, "Oh my gosh, I can't believe she let her kids say that." And I thought, well, we talked about how in Nemo, little Nemo's got one fin that's a little bit different than the other one. And the lady behind the register was just thrilled that we were having this conversation, and not in a way that was like she's bad or wrong or something, whatever, but more of a, me educating my then, I think he was 3-year-old, that there are differences and that it's, kind of like the Nemo.
Exactly.
And he completely was like, oh yeah, of course, it was not a big deal. So if I'd have said, don't, then I would have been giving him the message, don't say it, don't notice, don't point out something. Whereas as children, that's how they learn, right? They don't know, right? You and I would see it and go, oh, the lady was probably born with a, whatever. But yeah, anyway, so to your point, I think that's a great comment. So during the time, so at age 5, she's diagnosed and she lives another 10 or 11 years. So
she lives until 17.
Oh, 17. Okay. So during that time, I know your family's lives are kind of revolving around where she needs to go for treatment and how to deal with treatment. Did you have things that you could do as a family? Like we use respite care for our Ian when we would go to just the rest of us go to a swimming weekend or something where we could do something where I didn't have to listen to alarms, listening for certain sounds and so on. And all those things that I know you went through as well, where you're just able to disconnect for a minute and take a little bit.
Well, I'll tell you, the 4 of us, myself, my husband, and my other 2 children, never once left Dahlia without any of us there.
Okay.
So that did not happen. And it was very complicated for my husband and I to go away together, which we could do for some years after the diagnosis. But in doing so, we need two people to stay at our house, a nurse and a babysitter. Because the nurse is not a babysitter, right? The nurse is not responsible for the other two kids, nor is the nurse responsible for entertaining Dahlia. So we need to have two people come. And then you're starting to deal with the dynamic between those two, right? How do they get along with each other? And plus, if we're going to go away for 2 nights, you're not going to get a nurse who's going to stay 48 hours because they got to be awake during the night. So you got to start having shifts. It's very complicated and, P.S., expensive. We did it a couple of times, but what we ended up doing more frequently is I would take the other two kids on vacation, or my husband would take the other two kids on vacation. And it took us quite a while to get to that point when we said, okay, wait, hang on. We got to focus on the other two and give them some sense of things we would have done otherwise. So I might take them to, wherever, whatever, Florida, and then my husband might take them to Arizona, whatever that we took them, it's irrelevant. But the idea that we could do that, and, there's some guilt involved in that for sure, because you wish you could all be going. Now, again, for 5 to 9, things weren't, we still could travel. We still could do things that regular families did. But 9 to 17, those 8 years, that was very intense. That was like our home was an ICU for 8 years. So there was no, it was hard to go 40 minutes away, let alone to think about doing something that would be more involved with that. I mean, the care, the machinery, the medications, all of it was way too much.
Yeah. Now, I'm just curious to know, how did your health insurance handle that? Because I know in my case, our health insurance really fought back against home nursing care to the point where we had to actually go to the media and make a big fuss to get them to do what was in our policy, not something we were asking that was out of the policy, but they just simply didn't want to cover it because it was expensive.
Oh, first of all, I do not know how anybody could afford to do this without some kind of extra help.
Oh, I know.
Now, in our case in Massachusetts, we have Kaylee Mulligan, or I assume it still exists. It's been 2 years since Dahlia died, but through from age 9 to age 17, we relied on this. And so this is a supplement to the regular, Blue Cross Blue Shield that we had. And they covered 100% of the nursing. Now, we had to have nursing.
Yeah.
We didn't have, there's one thing to be allotted nursing hours, okay? So let's say we were allotted 108 nursing hours a week. Well, first of all, that's fine, but that's not 100% of the hours. And more important, there's a nursing shortage. And P.S., during COVID, nobody wants to come and be, in your house. So that was a whole other thing. But finding nurses was really hard. Now, but the nursing hours were covered and the medications were covered. And most of the equipment, not all. For example, I'll give you a perfect example of how these things end up costing families so much money. We couldn't know, when this whole thing happened, when my daughter was 9, her bedroom was on the second floor. So we come home from the hospital and her bedroom's on the second floor, which means every time we're going up and down, we're moving, carrying her wheelchair, the ventilator, the food pump, and so on and so forth. Also, our bathroom could not accommodate a wheelchair. I mean, just all these things. Our house was not set up appropriately. So we needed to build an extension down on the first floor. Okay? An addition. That's how these things cost money. Or Dahlia became a 2-person lift, meaning the nurses got to the point where they wouldn't stay with her home alone. So if we weren't going to both be home, we needed a second person. Now, no insurance is going to cover that, no matter how generous they are. So we had to have that backup person we had to pay for, so there's a lot of expenses. And then just, so many other things that come up that you end up needing to pay for. But in terms of the nursing care itself, that was fully covered. Thank God.
That's fantastic. And we are in Washington State here. I think, as I told you, we don't have such a law. Would be lovely if we did it federally, but that's a totally different show and a book in and of itself. But we had 18 hours a day. So my husband and I took shifts from 11 o'clock at night till 7 in the morning. One of us was up.
Yep.
I'm not going to lie. It was partly those years were what ended that marriage. So,
that, I mean, I'm sure that it's like well over 3/4 of couples, I think it's 87% of couples who have a kid with special needs, let alone medically complex, right, end up splitting up. So
it's true. And I mean, it wasn't our only factors, but it definitely did not do us any favors whatsoever. Even 4.5 years for us, were absolutely devastating to become a caregiver at that level. I mean, I worked in healthcare, but I'm not a clinician. My doctorate's in leadership, for example. So it's kind of, one of those things where you have to learn all these
everything. Oh,
all
please. I was in marketing and my husband was a high school English teacher. So,
the
not
things
our
you
forte.
learn. I learned how to troubleshoot a feeding pump. Like I could train nurses how to do it, or how to,
Oh, yeah.
I mean, all this kind of stuff would be like, because I did it all the time. And so,
Yeah.
yes, I completely understand that. Our house was 100 years old. And my son's room was supposed to be on the second floor. And I had to renovate my office on the first floor to make it his room, and remodel the bathroom to get a lift in there. And it was completely relating to everything you're saying here. And all of that was out of our pocket. Our insurance company didn't cover any of those things. And,
Right.
we actually donated most of his equipment to other families with special needs kids that didn't have coverage. They couldn't Medicaid. Nobody was going to cover them to have a wheelchair that had all the little fancy things that my sons had. But to be able to donate, that was actually made me feel like I was paying something forward to a family.
I agree. It felt really, really gratifying to be able to help other families in that way. But the other thing is that, we dealt with is that as Dahlia grew, we would need to get new wheelchairs, new equipment, she would grow out of things. So,
yep. No, I hear you there. I know for us, well, of course, my son only lived 4.5 years. We had we had the special stroller, then we had a wheelchair, then we had the second wheelchair. But yes. And in my case, I'm kind of curious if you are similar with me in here, where there were certain things that I did not want to give up right away when my son passed away. And one of those things was his last wheelchair. And I don't know why. I think for me, it was because it was the way he could actually be part of the world. It was his transportation. It was like his legs, if you will. So I didn't donate his wheelchair till probably about 10 years after he passed away, was when I finally felt I was able to give that up. And in our case, I found a family that had twins with a degenerative illness. And so the chair went to help two babies, which made me feel like, anyway. So yeah, those types of things where it's like, I just had to hang on to that. And it's kind of like, why would you want to hang on to a wheelchair of all
No, I get it. Dahlia's lift in her room is still there. And I'll tell you, in her bathroom, we have magnetic boards that have notes to the nurses, checklists of everything they need to do. The overnight nurses, the day nurses, etc. They're still there. I can't imagine erasing those.
Yes. No, I'm with you. So I'm years ahead of you in the journey, but I totally understand and support you to do whatever needs to be done with those things. I know, again, when I've moved since my son passed away, I did move, and I have a box now of my memorabilia that I kept from him, and some of them seems really weird. I have his ankle support braces that just weird stuff. You're like, why? But anyway, I don't know why, but that's what it is, and so I'm keeping them, and that's me. But I could totally get that. So since Dahlia passed away, tell me what your family dynamics have been like. What kind of differences have happened, and what's going on with you and your husband and the other kids?
Yeah. So, it is still very new. It's been just 2.5 years. And, what we learn is that people deal with grief in very different ways. And it's surprising because you think, well, if you lose the same person, right? And if the person has the same relation to you. So a perfect example would be myself and my husband, right? We both lost the same human being. We both lost our daughter. And we deal with grief very differently. As you and I spoke about before we were recording, we love talking about our children. And I would do it all day long, tell stories about Dahlia, talk about Dahlia. That to me is very, very meaningful.
Yes.
And my husband would loathe the idea of doing that. He's much more internal, right? And so, I learned that the first time when my first of my two sisters died, how this meant something different to me than it did to our other sister, because our relationships were different.
Right.
Because as siblings, sibling loss, which is a whole other thing, and it's, often disenfranchised, we identify ourselves very much in relation to our siblings. I'm the youngest of three, or I'm this one or that one, right? And so it changes your identity very profoundly when you lose a sibling, which again, having lost a sibling at 27, and then a couple of decades later, losing my second sibling and seeing even how that changed because it was over time. But I am in a unique position of being the parent of two people who have lost siblings. Yeah. And I get that loss very intimately. So I understand that when a child dies, the communities wrap their arms around the parents.
Yes.
There's a general understanding in society that the worst thing that can happen is losing a child. That bothers me. I don't think that it's on other people to decide what the worst thing that can happen is.
Good
I think
point.
losing a sibling is pretty much right up there. And what happens is the siblings get overlooked.
Mhm.
And again, as somebody who lost two siblings and now the mother of two children who lost a sibling, which now gets a little sounds confusing, but I'm very aware of that. And I witnessed it. I saw how many people were bringing little gifts and food and this and that and the other thing to myself and my husband. But very few people were sending things deliberately solely to the children, you know? And that's something that I really like to share with people because you might not think about it, which is when there's a loss and those kids are there, and it doesn't even have to be a family loss, but if a parent is mourning, the kids feel it, right? So giving the kid whatever based on the age, a stuffed animal, a throw, a book, taking the kid out to ice cream, doing something that focuses on the child, the sibling, or in whatever the relationship might be, is so meaningful and valuable and overlooked. And I think it's a way we could do better as a society.
Yes, I would add to that. Not only is it a way to help the children, but it is a way to help the parents too.
Oh, it's a huge help to the parents, right? Exactly.
You want to help me take my kids to the zoo for the day, so they could, and I love that. I mean, I did have friends who would ask me, what can I do? What can I do?
Yeah.
And that would there's my suggestion. Why don't you take my other kids and
right. So now for anybody who's listening, don't ask what can I do? No.
Yes,
and offer,
absolutely.
right? Because that's another thing. We don't want to be you know what? I have enough going on without trying to figure out what you can do.
Yep.
So here's an idea. How about you make a menu of things that might be useful to me and give it to me and let me choose?
Yep.
Want me to do your groceries? Want me to mow your lawn? Want me to take your kids?
I love that. And I do that when I encounter someone who's grieving, as I will say that to them. And here are some things that I'd be happy to do, that I'm able to do. What can help you? I mean, I don't want to assume what groceries you want, but I'll go grocery shopping. Give me your grocery list or whatever that might be, rather than But I think for a lot of people, especially if they're new to having a family member or a friend go through grief, they just don't know that. So
people don't know. We're so awkward around it. We're so uncomfortable around grief. I mean, till you've been through it, and every single one of us will.
Yeah, unfortunately, yes. And you mentioned your TED Talk, so I know I want to put in the podcast notes a link to your TED Talk, because you say in there you talk about things to say and things not to say.
Yeah, because it is about the fact that grief is an incredibly lonely, lonely place to be.
Right.
And we are all going to be grievers. We are all going to want to comfort somebody who's grieving, right? So it ought to be the great unifier. It ought to be the thing that connects us to each other. But it isn't, because we are so awkward and uncomfortable, right? And so many of the things that we say when we don't know what to say can be hurtful. And of course, everybody's doing their best. And I'm sure I have said some wackadoodle things in my time too. We all do it. But you think about those things that people say, like, I can't imagine. Well, is there anything in this world that makes us feel more alone than when somebody can't even imagine what we're going through? I mean, talk about erecting a wall, right? Or when they say anything that starts with at least. That's not your job to look at the bright side, right? Don't tell me at least you didn't suffer, at least you didn't this, at least you know what I mean? I don't want to hear that.
Yep.
And even things like, you're so strong. I mean, listen, I get that all the time, having had so much loss. You're so strong. Well, that makes me feel like I have to live up to other people's expectations of being strong. Like I can't show my vulnerability.
Exactly.
Right? So, I talk a lot about how we are grief illiterate and how as a society we can do better, because there are ways where we can learn these things if they were taught in our workplaces, in our schools, in our religious institutions, where we could get comfortable with grief and tend to it like we do other life cycle events. Mm-hmm. And particularly in Western culture, we do a really lousy job.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would add to your examples there, where someone would say, I don't know how you've managed to survive all this. I don't know how you've done this. And in my head, I'm always thinking, well, what's the alternative? I'm just curious.
Sure. And I will tell you, I have a podcast called I Don't Know How You Do It. And that's exactly where it comes from. My whole life, decades, people would say to me, when we had the 3 kids, even before Dahlia became really sick, but just as 2 working parents with 3 kids and a whole host of stuff going on every single day. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. And so that's why my podcast is called I Don't Know How You Do It, right? Because I'm talking to people who are on the receiving end of that statement for whatever reason.
Yep.
There's all kinds of reasons, but so it's tongue in cheek, but that is a thing that we hear all the time.
Yep. Yep. I think, but again, I've come up with different responses of my own over the years, but the first thing that comes to my head is always, but what would you suggest? What would I be
Yeah.
like?
What choice do you have? Sometimes people say, I don't know how you do it. It makes you feel, oh, I could never do that. Then you feel like, oh, well, you must love your kid more than I love my kid if you could never do it. Right. And again, it's so important to point out that all these things are said out of, a place of
Yeah.
well-meaning. And,
Yes.
it's
Yeah.
just that it's intent versus impact.
Exactly. Exactly. And I emphasize that too. I don't think anyone ever said anything to me that I thought was intentionally cruel, but some comments were really not, really not helpful, really not at all helpful. So
Right.
now I want to talk about two more things before we go. First, I want to talk about the Mayan celebration you did for.
Oh, yeah. Thank you for asking. Yeah. So, as I mentioned, all three of my kids were adopted from Guatemala and we're Jewish. So when my daughter died, we had a very traditional Jewish funeral and Shiva for her, as I had for all the other members of my family who have died. But there was something missing, which is honoring her heritage. It was one thing to honor the piece of her heritage that she, you know, put on and lived with her whole life with us, but her heritage is Mayan, and so we went to Guatemala. We've just been back a few days, and we had a traditional Mayan ceremony with a priestess who we made an altar, and it was just such a beautiful, beautiful experience. The altar has flower petals and candy and sugar as offerings, sweetness for our daughter, and incense. And in this this Mayan dialect called Kichi, there are 22 Mayan dialects. In this particular Mayan dialect, this priestess spoke for about 35, 40 minutes, and we didn't understand anything she was saying. Now, I think of it as an epic game of telephone, because what happened is she was saying these mantras, these prayers, and we had this offering, and so there was smoke rising up, and by the direction of the fire and the smoke and the patterns of the ashes, she was reading back messages from above, from our daughter, from the spirits. But she could only speak in Kichi, so she would read these messages from above, share them with a guide we had with us in Kichi, but he spoke Spanish, which we don't speak. So then he would take it in Spanish, and I asked him to type it into the phone so that we could do the translator app to get it into English. So talk about a mystical game of telephone.
Wow.
And yet we still got messages that we felt very strongly resonated with us as coming from our daughter, and more important, it felt right. It felt like I don't want to say a sense of closure, because there will never be closure, nor would I want there to be, but it felt like the next right thing in integrating the loss.
Right, right. Oh, that's beautiful. That's absolutely beautiful. The last thing I definitely want to bring up is you have talked about how you're thinking kind of marinated on another idea for another book. So what have you got?
Yeah, I've got a couple of books that I'm thinking about, and one of them actually is based on this experience that we just had in Guatemala. And I'm very interested in exploring how we connect, how we stay most connected. And I mean, look, you just said you keep the leg braces, you keep a box. What do we do in different cultures? What makes us feel most attached? And so this is a real-time journey that we're going on to explore what are different ways people stay connected. And then I'm also working on something. I have a column in Psychology Today called Grace and Grief. And because this book was written prior to my daughter's death, it's really not a book about grief. Of course, it's about many kinds of grief, like ambiguous grief and anticipatory grief, but it's not about grief that comes from the death of a person. And so I have some things I'm working on in that respect as well.
Wonderful. Well, I have been just so excited to hear your story today. So is there anything else you'd like to share before we end?
No, I know you're going to have notes where people can find me. I would invite anybody who's listening, please connect with me. I love hearing people's stories and connecting and sharing, and you can do that in the notes. You'll see my website or my social handles, but
It's
yeah.
so powerful. It's so powerful. I learn something new from everyone I talk to on my podcast. And like I mentioned before we started recording, I get emails from people who just so relate to a story, and it's so powerful, and it speaks to your comment about how we do need to learn more about grieving and how to work with people who are grieving, because we're all going to be there at some point in time, and we all do respond differently. I mean, to your comment about the sibling loss being different than a child loss or a parent loss or friend, whatever it might be, it's all very different. I can speak to that myself. So, yeah, it definitely is something we should all be thinking about, and how we can talk to people that we know and we love and we live next to and work with and so on. It's so powerful. But Jessica, thank you so much for your time today. I have really appreciated learning more about you and your family.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Good Grief. We hope that the stories shared today have inspired and empowered you on your own journey of resilience. If you want to dive deeper into the themes of trauma, tragedy, and survival, be sure to check out my memoir, The Day I Became the Spider Killer, a memoir of trauma, tragedy, and survival. In this book, I shared my own raw and honest experiences, offering insights and strategies for overcoming life's toughest challenges. You can purchase the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or listen to it on Audible. Your support helps us continue to bring these powerful stories to light and spread a message of hope and resilience. Stay tuned for more incredible stories on our next episode. Until then, remember, even in the face of life's toughest trials, there can be light, growth, and good grief.